Die Übersetzung von Jans Stimme vom Deutschen ins Englische wurde mit einer KI erstellt.
In January, the United States launched an offensive against Venezuela, abducting its president. Now, the US is engaged in a war with Iran, a conflict that appears to be entering its de-escalation phase. And already, Washington has a new target: Cuba. Cuba, the island nation off the coast of the United States, has been under socialist rule for nearly 7 decades. And Cuba now faces an enormous problem. It is running out of oil. This is no coincidence, as the US has significantly ratcheted up pressure. There has always been an economic blockade against Cuba, but this has now been expanded. No more oil is entering the country. In short, Cuba is under immense economic, political, and strategic pressure. The question is Cuba being forced towards a US-friendly government similar to Venezuela without military intervention? What's currently unfolding might seem somewhat complex at first glance, but at its core, it is quite clear. And that's what we will examine in detail today.
In Crisis Mode, the podcast from Conflict Zones with Jan Jessen.
I am Jan Jessen, political editor-in-chief at NRZ and a crisis and war reporter for the Funke Mediengruppe. To truly understand what is happening in Cuba right now, it is indeed worthwhile to first look at Venezuela. Because there, as you all know, something decisive happened in January. We have covered this several times in this podcast. We will put the follow-up episodes in the show notes for you. You'll remember, President Maduro, whom the US accused of being a drug trafficker and a threat to US security, he was abducted at the time as part of a US military operation against Venezuela. This was not a major war. It was a brief military action involving airstrikes and, as mentioned, the abduction of Maduro. And now, a government is in power in Venezuela that originates from the old regime, but is considerably more US-friendly than Maduro. This government is now opening up the economy, but politically, the system essentially remains the same. However, this also shifts the balance of power in the region. Our first interviewee is Dr. Claudia Ziller from the German Institute for International and Security Affairs in Berlin. She says, without Venezuela and the events that transpired there, Cuba is currently difficult to understand.
Was wir zurzeit in Venezuela beobachten, ist eine ökonomische Transformation ohne politische Transition.
What we are currently observing in Venezuela is an economic transformation without political transition. This means that a systemic policy change is taking place. A great deal is being reformed within the economy. Politically, there are reforms, but they do not fundamentally alter the nature of governance. And many important laws for the reform of the energy sector, as well as mining, are progressing very quickly and are being passed. All of this is in the spirit of opening up the economy, providing guarantees for foreign capital, and, as we can assume, in close cooperation with the government of the USA, because both parties, both the Trump administration and the government of Delcy Rodriguez, consistently report very, very good cooperation.
Die Regierung Trump als auch die Regierung von Delcy Rodriguez berichten stets von einer sehr, sehr guten Zusammenarbeit.
Yes, so a lot is changing. The economy is opening up under pressure from the US, which now smells good business, especially, of course, for its oil companies. One must not forget, Venezuela has the largest oil reserves in the world, significantly more than, for example, Saudi Arabia or other Gulf states. And in that respect, it is naturally a very interesting country for the American oil industry. And now, through the intention to open up this country, to reform the energy sector, to reform mining, these are all things that will benefit potential US investors. However, and this is also very important, Caracas is opening up economically, but without a democratic transition. When the US attacked Venezuela, I also spoke with people in the opposition who naturally hoped that the regime's stranglehold would now loosen. That is, the multitude of intelligence agencies and all the pressure that weighed on the people, that this would now be over, but that definitely doesn't interest the US. That doesn't interest the Trump administration. For the US, business is important, and they are getting it now. However, this also has very direct consequences for Cuba. Venezuela, a long-standing ally of Cuba, also state socialist, was the most important oil supplier for Cuba. That is no longer the case. The channel has dried up, and Washington is apparently also ensuring that alternative deliveries, for example from Russia and other countries, do not arrive. The result is Cuba's energy supply is collapsing, and this is becoming a political leverage. However, it must also be said that in Venezuela, even if the regime still exists, meaning essentially the old figures, except for Maduro, of course, at least in Dr. Zilla's opinion, something has changed a little.
Also, es ist spürbar, dass das Regime
It is palpable that the regime is becoming less repressive. However, this does not mean that any conditions are being created for free elections. Nothing is being done on that front, or that parts of the opposition are being invited to discuss the country's future. None of that is happening. So therefore, a certain liberalization, which, however, does not democratize and does not mean more co-determination for citizens.
aber nicht Demokratisierung und nicht mehr Mitbestimmung der Bürgerinnen und Bürger bedeutet.
Now, of course, one can compare Venezuela and Cuba, both state socialist countries where their own populations have been subjected to repression, where there was either a neutralized or virtually neutralized opposition in Venezuela, or none at all, as in Cuba. But there are clear differences. This already starts with raw material deposits.
Der offensichtliche Unterschied ist, dass Kuba nicht die Ölvorkommen von Venezuela hat und dass das ein Inselstaat ist, das halb so groß ist, was die Bevölkerung angeht.
The obvious difference is that Cuba does not have the oil reserves of Venezuela and that it is an island nation, half the size in terms of population, and not continentally integrated into South America. So I would say, on the one hand, Cuba's situation is much more precarious, much more isolated, cut off from the world. The leadership seems more cohesive, so the cohesion is greater and characterized by family ties. This means there is more cohesion among those who are in charge there, and they are also part of the military. At the same time, Cuba has a symbolic power that Venezuela does not possess. So, there was no revolution in Venezuela like in Cuba. And for all the heroism emphasized in Venezuelan propaganda, Cuba can offer more in this area, symbolically, historically, ideologically. Cuba has a Che Guevara, and Venezuela does not.
Kuba kann in diesem Bereich mehr anbieten, symbolisch, historisch, ideologisch. Kuba hat ein Che Guevara und nicht Venezuela.
The question now naturally arises, if there is no oil there, and we noted earlier that oil was certainly one of Donald Trump's most important motivations for acting in Venezuela to gain access to the oil wells, why then is Trump so interested in Cuba? And there is, I believe, on the one hand the symbolic level, a socialist revolution right on the doorstep of the US. That was always a thorn in the side of the Americans, the motherland of capitalism, and on the other hand, the large diaspora, Cubans, who at least in Florida represent a significant voting potential. Former US Senator Marco Rubio has parents who were born in Cuba, so very symbolic. But there are also other reasons, says Dr. Zilla.
Es hat keine besonderen Rohstoffvorkommen, aber es könnte eine sehr interessante.
It has no special raw material deposits, but it could become a very interesting Caribbean Riviera. So, at the moment, the Castro family, or the military holding Geisa, this economic bloc, owns many luxury hotels, and that in cooperation with Spanish capital. And currently, tourism in Cuba has collapsed because flights have been interrupted, because the situation is so precarious due to power outages, and because it is not clear what will happen in the next few days. But from a tourism perspective, the island has great potential, which has partly already been used. And you mentioned another difference. So we have a larger Venezuelan diaspora, but in the US, the role of Cuban exiles is more significant than that of Venezuelans there.
Eine größere venezolanische Diaspora, aber in den USA ist die Rolle der Exil-KubanerInnen bedeutender als die der Venezolaner dort.
So a lot is coming together in Cuba politically and economically. It is a symbolically charged island. There are Cuban exiles who exert pressure. There is the economic side, tourism, which Dr. Ziller just mentioned. And all of this is now hitting an island suffering from a massive energy shortage. The Americans are tightening the stranglehold more and more. And the question, of course, is military escalation to be expected, or will it be a deal? Just a few days ago, Cuba's deputy foreign minister said that they were prepared for a military intervention. He, of course, has to say that to reassure the people, but it also shows that they don't really know how the US will react.
Ja, das Militärpotenzial Irans ist in Kuba nicht vorhanden. Und gleichzeitig, als gesagt hat, wir bereiten uns vor, das muss gesagt werden.
Yes, Iran's military potential is not present in Cuba. And at the same time, when he said, "We are preparing," it must be said, that belongs to national propaganda and also to the sovereignty of a country, both. At the same time, he said he rather rules out a US invasion. So, along the lines of, yes, we cannot but prepare, but we assume it won't happen. And above all, it is hoped that it won't happen. And that is why talks are taking place. So, meanwhile, both the Cuban and the US sides have confirmed that there are talks. And I don't believe that the US is interested in boots on the ground, meaning ground troops. They will avoid that. And if the US considers Venezuela a success, which is the case, then they will try to do the same. And possibly an abduction might not even be necessary, because President Miguel Díaz-Canel is not a powerful man. Unlike Maduro, I would say, he represents the country's ideology even less than Maduro. So, Maduro, as Chávez's successor, perhaps embodies Chavismo a bit more than Miguel Díaz-Canel embodies Cuban socialism. I think so.
Den Chavismus vielleicht ein bisschen mehr als Miguel Díaz-Canel den kubanischen Sozialismus, glaube ich schon. Also und deswegen, Miguel Díaz-Canel könnte schnell weg sein und dann wird mit dem harten Kern kooperiert, nämlich die Castros herum.
So Dr. Ziller clearly assumes no tanks, no ground troops, and no airstrikes either. Instead, a strengthening of the economic stranglehold, a minimal willingness for boots on the ground, meaning ground troops. I personally don't assume that either. Ground troops, that is always a huge potential danger for the commander-in-chief of the US, in this case Donald Trump, because boots on the ground means soldiers who are massively endangered. And if fighting takes place on the ground, the air superiority that the US definitely has over Cuba is somewhat neutralized, and one has seen in the wars in Afghanistan or Iraq that one can quickly get bogged down if ground troops are deployed. That can work if commando units are sent to extract people, as happened to Maduro, the president or former president of Venezuela. But the Americans apparently do not intend to exfiltrate, abduct, and bring leading figures of the regime in Cuba to the US to put them on trial there. At least there has been no announcement to date that any of these individuals would be designated as terrorists or drug traffickers. What all of this specifically means for the people in Cuba is described by Professor Bert Hoffmann. He is a Cuba expert, works at the Giga Institute in Hamburg, and has just recently been on the island himself.
Ja, die Situation ist tatsächlich dramatisch, das kann man kaum überzeichnen. Kuba kriegt seit inzwischen 2,5 Monaten kein Öl ins Land. Und Kuba
Yes, the situation is indeed dramatic. It can hardly be overstated. Cuba has not received oil for 2.5 months now, and Cuba is 100% dependent on imports for diesel and gasoline. This means all trucks run on diesel, which is now completely running out. Everything is becoming scarce, and without trucks, food no longer gets from the countryside to the city, pregnant women no longer get to the clinic, oxygen no longer gets to hospitals, water pumps for drinking water supply no longer work. So it has all indeed become very, very dramatic for the population. And that is, so to speak, the cynical game. The big political question of liberating Cuba, regime change, is being fought on the backs of the people. That is what you hear again and again from the people. This doesn't hurt the state president. It specifically hurts me as an ordinary person. There is a great bitterness that you hear almost everywhere, and the situation gets worse day by day. And there is so little prospect that it will get better.
Schlechter werden und es gibt so wenig Aussicht, dass sie besser wird.
So what Professor Hoffman outlines is a country, an island, on the verge of a humanitarian catastrophe. And that is, of course, also a game, one must say, that the Americans are playing there on the backs of ordinary people. The regime forces will probably not suffer from it. This may exert internal political pressure on the government in Cuba to finally agree to negotiations. On the other hand, as Hoffman says, what is happening right now is cynical. And Hoffman, like Dr. Ziller, believes that in addition to tourism aspects, symbolic politics plays a very large role.
Sie haben schon völlig recht. Was Kuba auszeichnet, ist dieses Symbol, die Revolution Fidels vor der Nase der USA, das eine Demütigung
You're absolutely
gewesen.
right. What distinguishes Cuba is this symbol, Fidel's revolution in the face of the U.S. That was a humiliation, and there is an unsettled score. But beyond that, there are also economic interests in Cuba. No oil. But the Cuban exiles, the Cubans who left after the revolution, largely live in the U.S. and are also an important political factor in the U.S. There are many old property claims, both on companies, on the sugarcane fields, on real estate in Havana. That is a very clearly definable interest, and the U.S. government has made it its own, to reclaim property for these now U.S. citizens. There is, of course, a lot of explosive material in that. A second interest is clearly tourism. If Spanish companies now manage hotels, then the Americans think, we could do that too. Then our companies would earn the money. The real estate market in Havana will certainly make some people rich. So, there are interests. Nevertheless, Cuba is always politically bigger than economically. And if the U.S. now, quasi under Trump, says, we want a new edition of this Monroe Doctrine, meaning that all of North and South America should essentially be a U.S.-friendly hemisphere, then this symbol, so to speak, must fall. And there must be a government in Havana that supports this foreign policy line, as the new government in Venezuela is now doing.
In Havana auch eine Regierung sein, die zumindest diese außenpolitische Linie mitfährt, wie es die neue Regierung in Venezuela jetzt tut.
Nevertheless, the question must be asked, and I wanted to discuss this with Professor Hoffman as well, how great the potential for military escalation is in such a crisis. But there too he is very clear.
Also ich nehme nicht an, dass wir in absehbarer Zeit eine Militäraktion der USA in Kuba haben werden. Das erscheint mir nicht das primäre Szenario. Gleichzeitig, wenn Trump 1 ist, ist es nicht ganz berechenbar, aber wir haben auch nicht diese.
So I don't assume that we will see U.S. military actions in Cuba in the foreseeable future. That doesn't seem to be the primary scenario to me. At the same time, if Trump is one thing, he is not entirely predictable. But we also don't have a situation like in Venezuela, where they would, so to speak, have to militarily remove the state president to bring the government into line. The Cuban leadership appears very cohesive, and if a deal agrees that a new person at the top is necessary, then the party leadership in Cuba and the military leadership can handle that alone. Then the president resigns, for health reasons or whatever, so I don't see that. Of course, Cuba has no military capacity to prevent or withstand a U.S. attack, but they certainly have the capacity to inflict some losses on the Americans. And above all, the aftermath is the completely open question. Afterwards, there would then be a U.S. military government. The U.S. needs someone to administer the country for them. And that is completely unclear if we really have a military strike. The last point on that, there is the U.S. military base in Guantanamo on Cuban territory. And that is potentially, if the U.S. really launches a military strike, also a hostage in the hands of the Cubans. So the Cubans can bombard the military base in Guantanamo. The defense capacity extends that far. And there would then be some dead, and I don't think anyone in the U.S. wants that. So I don't see that as the primary interest of either the U.S. or Cuba. Nevertheless, we currently have so many U.S. military strikes that Cuba is, of course, preparing for it, and also, of course, saying we will not give up without a fight.
Weder der USA noch Kubas ist. Trotzdem haben wir so viele Militärschläge der USA gerade, dass natürlich Kuba sich darauf vorbereitet und dann natürlich auch dicke Backen macht und sagt, ey, wir werden nicht kampflos aufgeben.
That's good news for now. Both experts consider military intervention rather unlikely. On the other hand, the economic pressure is a catastrophe for the people in Cuba. There have already been several island-wide power outages because the electricity supply also relies on diesel. And the question is, how long can Cuba endure this without collapsing?
Das ist, was die USA herbeiführen, ganz klar, natürlich. Also, wenn sie keinen Diesel haben, dann kommt nicht mal die humanitäre
That's what the U.S. is causing, quite clearly, of course. If you don't have diesel, humanitarian aid can't even get from the port to the shops for distribution. So many things require diesel or gasoline, and at the moment, the supply is barely above zero. Only very small quantities arrive via private imports, not via tankers, but in normal container ships, in containers that are actually otherwise intended for freight transport. That's not something that really keeps the country afloat. A lot of improvisation is happening. The country still manages, so to speak, to maintain a basic level of normality in some areas. Most pregnant women still get to the hospital somehow. But you see the fuel gauge. With every trip made, there's less in it, and that's a very, very threatening situation.
Aber Sie sehen den Tank, der geht runter. Mit jeder Fahrt, die gemacht wird, ist weniger am Tank. Und das ist schon eine sehr, sehr bedrohliche Situation.
I personally assume that Trump will certainly want to seize Cuba politically. He has made that very clear in recent days. Even during the ongoing Iran war, he spoke of it being a great honor to take on Cuba. Lately, it has been a great honor for him to do many things publicly, including killing people in Iran. He also said that, now that he wants to claim Cuba, that too is a great honor for Donald Trump. And I have the impression that he will make a somewhat easy exit if he stumbles out of the Iran war into which he stumbled. A war that was conducted incredibly clumsily, that was completely aimless, that ultimately did not or will not lead to, one must say, at the time of recording this episode, the Iran war is still ongoing, but I assume it will be over in a few days. But the government, the regime, the Mullah regime, will remain in power. There is nothing to suggest that it will collapse quickly now. Essentially, what happened there is a defeat for the Americans and also for Israel, and the mullahs will be able to celebrate themselves as victors. Of course, Trump will do that too, but in the end, he knows that he lost this war in the eyes of the world public. And all the more important then, might it be as a signal to the domestic US audience before the midterms, which are coming up soon, at the end of the year, that the signal goes out to his own electorate. At least in our backyard, we are number one. Make America great again. Make America so great that we also dominate the entire, so to speak, American hemisphere, both the North and the South. And in that respect, I could imagine that he will not let himself be dissuaded from taking Cuba, in whatever way. I don't believe that there will be a military action. I don't believe that they will send troops there, but they will definitely force the government to give up, simply out of concern for the population, and possibly then also initiate democratic reforms, so not just economic reforms that enable Americans to do business or American investors to do business on the island, which allow American tourists to have a nice vacation there, and possibly Trump's real estate business will also benefit. He wants to turn everything into a Riviera, Gaza, but possibly also Cuba, and one has to see whether that can actually be implemented. I believe Trump will do a lot to make that happen, and from that perspective, one must of course also say that it is the end, or would then be the end, of leftist state socialism in South America, even if there are still leftist movements in Latin America. But it would be the end of state socialism, as Cuba exemplified it, as Venezuela also exemplified it for a few years. That may also not be bad, but the methods that Trump and his government are currently choosing for it are not only cynical, but it is a catastrophe for the people who are now really facing huge problems. I am curious to see how this develops in the coming weeks. I may also have the opportunity to travel to Cuba myself. If so, we would of course produce an episode for our podcast In Crisis Mode from there as well. That was In Crisis Mode. The episode was produced by Alexander Baumeister, who is also a journalist for a radio station of the Funke Mediengruppe. All episodes can also be found on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Deezer, and YouTube. Feel free to send us an email with questions and suggestions at krisenmodus@funkemedien.de. Follow us and recommend us. That helps make our work more visible. Take care. See you soon.
In Crisis Mode, the podcast from Conflict Zones with Jan Jessen.
Ein Podcast von Funke.